Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Politics Relaxed. We're very lucky to be joined by a Labour legend, Lord Neil Kinnock. He was leader of the Labour Party from 1983 until 1992 and Vice President of the European Commission, among many other roles. So I'll just get started. First of all, thanks for joining us. When we announced this interview, this was probably the most suggested question. What would you have done differently, if anything, in your time as Labour leader?
Well, I'd have won. I know what I would have done differently if it had been possible, and that is to get the comprehensive policy review that we undertook done much more quickly. There was a problem in trying to do that because I was elected in October 1983. I got the policy review underway in January 1984. And it was always going to be a struggle because, of course, they were almost religious, devotional commitment to some of the policies and practices that I knew we had to change. And that would have been tough in any case. But then we were hit by the 12-month miners' strike. And for understandable reasons, the labor movement was mentally and physically totally preoccupied with the lead up to the strike, the conduct of the strike, and the aftermath of the strike. So that took 2 years, 20 months, 24 months out of any process of review and renovation, with the result that we'd only really made a start by the time we got to the 87 election. And we had to start almost from scratch in the wake of that election. When we did that, the review was deep-rooted, far-reaching, and the changes were authentic and sincere and effective. But it wasn't quite enough, obviously, given the size of the mountain we had to climb. The Tory majority in 87 of 102, which was down by comparison with 83, but still very substantial. And we ended up losing in 92 by 21 seats. It was some degree of comfort, some degree of discomfort to me when I was told that the bottom 11 Conservative victories in seats were won by a total of 1,240 votes. So it was damn near. But had I been able to do what I wanted to do, the review and revision, the dismissal of some policies, the strengthening and explanation of others would have been much more rapid and much more effective, so that the changes we'd made would be more widely regarded to have been genuine and in no sense cosmetic or superficial. And not doing that, I believe, really contributed significantly to losing the election. It wasn't the only thing. There were other factors, but that was, I think, by some distance, the main one. People didn't know really, or not enough people knew, how much we changed. I mean, we gained 3 million votes, but we needed to gain more than 3 million, and we didn't make that.
Yeah. You mentioned the miners' strikes, and I've actually got a question on it, so I'll go to that. Under your leadership, you had to deal with the miners' strikes. Are you happy with how you dealt with them, and what would your advice be to the current leadership on how to deal with the upcoming strikes?
They are two completely different planets, really. The current disputes are being explained by the leadership. Where strikes have taken place, they've done so on the basis of high turnout, substantial majorities amongst the membership. So there's no question about their legitimacy or the fact that they are sincerely supported by very large majorities. That is entirely different, of course, from the Scargill strike, because he didn't have a national ballot, thus breaching NUM rules in the event of a national strike. And the result was a divided labour force, with some coalfields, notably Nottinghamshire, not going on strike, and several other collieries around the country. And it also meant that the appeal to solidarity action, which of course is vital in a coal strike, particularly in transport and also in the power stations, that appeal was never going to get a response, because without a democratic ballot, the legitimacy of the strike was always in question. So with the divided labour force and the lack of solidarity action, the miners were on their own, confronted by a fastidiously planned offensive by the Conservative government. I could go down the list of the plans and provisions that they made in a strike which actually cost about £30 billion in 1985 prices. Now, we're not in that condition now, and therefore Keir Starmer can draw attention to the fact that the disputes taking place now are against the background of real-term wage reductions at a time of extensive and very serious price inflation, and that the disputes, while regretting hugely the terrible inconvenience for parts of the travelling public or whatever other consumers and clients are affected, are nevertheless the exercise of a right of freedom in a free country. And so the context of these strikes is entirely different from anything that happened in the miners' dispute of 84, 85. How should he handle it? Well, I've suggested that without aligning himself with the strikers or going to picket lines or undertaking other demonstrative action, which frequently, I have to say, not always, but frequently, is an egotistical gesture by some MPs who simply want to be seen on the picket line, making no sacrifice themselves, of course, either as workers or indeed as users of services, and not putting themselves or their jobs in any jeopardy, simply doing it for photogenic reasons. I'm sure there are people entirely sincere about going to talk to strikers on the picket line, and nobody can seriously object to that. But to number themselves amongst pickets where they're making no sacrifice and getting publicity, I think is always pretty shallow. And then, having made it clear that he doesn't think the strike should be taking place because of the government's duty, responsibility to intervene to try and resolve the dispute, I think that Keir could safeguard his position and focus attention where it really should be, which is on the irresponsibility of the government, which has a real role, certainly in the rail dispute, as it will have in the disputes that are coming or with us amongst barristers against the background of a 35% cut in legal aid over recent years. That's gigantic. And when doctors are in dispute, that clearly again is because so many doctors, both in general practice and the hospital service, have suffered real terms deterioration in the value of their incomes and in working conditions. You can go on to teachers, because the generality of the workforce, other than some extremely well-paid people, the generality of the workforce has been hit by wage freezes or very low rises against the changing cost of living. And you get a combination of widespread consumer price inflation, charges for energy, charges for transport and other essential services, and set against that, wage increases that either don't occur or don't begin to match the levels of price rises. And you've got a formula for serious upheaval. And the government can't evade its responsibility in any of those areas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinnock. You came in 1983. You sought to modernise the party and grow it into something new and different. To what extent do you think that you actually laid the groundwork for the 1997 landslide victory for Tony Blair?
Well, most analysts and commentators, and indeed including Tony himself and Gordon Brown and others who led that government, attribute their success in significant part to me. I think I remember Tony's opening phrase, which was something like, he never wore the garb of Prime Minister, but none of us would be where we are now without his efforts. So, okay, that's fine. What I set out to do in 83, faced with a party that was in chaos in every respect, despite the valiant efforts, very gutsy efforts by my predecessor, Michael Foot, who'd kept the party together in tumultuous circumstances. And despite the systematic and systemic disruption inflicted by the so-called Benite faction, as well as the fringe leftists of various kinds. Militant was the best known, but that wasn't the only one. So the party was in very serious financial deficit. It had no communication strategy to speak of, and it had a package of policies, though package is not enough of a word to describe the breadth of it, that were simply, well, they were a mixture of the absurd and, for many voters, including many Labour voters, the repulsive, as well as some worthy and admirable and quite necessary policies. But of course, the worthy, admirable, and necessary policies were completely obscured by the daft list of commitments that Labour had made, as well as the conduct of a party that was strongly influenced at the time, not by a majority, but by a very effectively organized minority, who characteristically were people who put a greater value on power in the Labour Party than they put on power for the Labour Party. And of course, that's the formula for disaster. Same kind of thing happened to the Tory Party just before and in the years following 1997. And those kind of people are still around in politics on the left and the right. They are much less influential now in the Labour Party than they were during the Jeremy Corbyn years, because of the effective action and stances that have been taken by Keir Starmer. But when I became leader of the party in 83, those people were pretty much in control of the institutions of the Labour Party, and therefore I had to deal politically and organizationally with them. I had to secure radical change, modernization, relevance in our policy stance, repair the finances, install an effective communication strategy, and get rid of some of the personalities. So that's what I set out to do. You describe it as modernization, and in many ways it was, but I thought of it at the time, and indeed since, more as a restoration of relevance than an ambition to, quote, move to the center or any other geographical term. I just wanted to restore the self-respect of the Labour Party and respect for the Labour Party, trustworthiness for the Labour Party. And that's what I worked on for 9 years. Obviously, I didn't do it enough. I didn't have the time to do it enough, or I didn't have the ability to do it enough. I don't know what the hell it was altogether. There's quite a lot of reasons, but it wasn't for want of trying. That's for certain.
Yeah, I mean, we know trustworthiness and integrity is something that we so very much need back in British politics now. We need it.
It's interesting you should say back in British politics, because I don't think that people much older than I, well, there are not many people much older than I, but I don't think anybody can find the time since we've had a democracy in this country, which is only since the late 1920s, really, when universal suffrage for over 21-year-olds was introduced. So it's still a fairly young democracy in some ways, but I don't think anybody can discover a time in which such a low regard is being given by government to those fundamental requirements of democracy, of integrity, trustworthiness, accountability, transparency, words that we've bandied around for decades in the rather comfortable circumstances of quite high standards of public conduct. Some with rules written down and enacted in law, but in many ways, because of what Peter Hennessy, the great contemporary historian, has described as the good chap theory of government. The idea that simply because people have got positions of responsibility, they will act with responsibility and integrity. And in the last couple of years, that's been torn to shreds, and we have to restore it. So I think the word back that you use is absolutely crucial.
It really is. And as with the lack of trust, young people have become so unhappy. And actually, not just young people, everyone. But in specific to young people, what would your advice be to us of the youth?
Well, decade in and decade out, when I've been asked this kind of question, I've had to say, and I still say, work out your own ideas, look around you, try to perceive, just lift the surface a bit and have a look underneath it. And that's in all things, but particularly in the way in which our democracy is run, the way in which it's motivated, the way in which it's manipulated, the way in which it's betrayed on occasions, in order to develop your own ideas about how things could and should be and what you can do in order to try and advance your conception of progress. I think if lots of young people think in those terms, we do get beneficial, even enthralling change. And in addition, and crucially in a democracy, people feel that they have a degree of influence on the direction of affairs, not simply through the ballot box, but in terms of expressing themselves, the way they organize, the priorities they attach in crucial areas of politics. If I just say at the same time, something that I encountered, I was lucky. When I was about 16 or 17, I came across the works of Jack London, who was an American socialist and wrote before the First World War. And he was a colorful writer. He wrote mainly adventure books. He only wrote one or two that could be described as political treaties. But Jack London said, when people were talking about the non-political person, Jack London says the non-political person has neither parents nor children, requires no shelter nor warmth, and simply doesn't have to go to sleep. No requirement for employment arises, and no encounter is ever made with ambition or disappointment. And when the non-political person dies, they will bury themselves. And I think it put like that, anybody can comprehend the need for engagement. And of course, in many countries in the world, that's really making a great demand when you're, by asserting your opinions, jeopardizing yourself or your family, who could be subjected to imprisonment, torture, murder. But in this country, in this democracy, even with the corrosion at the edges and indeed the rottenness at the core, this is still a free country. And people really do have the individual liberty to express themselves within, generally speaking, quite rational rules. Although even that legal system is being despoiled at the moment with infringements on human rights. But nevertheless, this isn't some way where you'll get shot. And so consequently, I hope that young people will be engaged. And since you asked for advice, that's my advice. Get involved. Don't leave it to other people. Don't let them run your life. Do everything you can to run your own life while trying to make things better for others.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think those are some really, really great words.
We were just talking about kind of how you create change. You've had a huge influence on British politics, as well as being close to some of the biggest players in Labour politics. What do you think it takes, and is there kind of these like skills or things in common that these people have to create real change in this country?
Well, I think in many cases the skills are manifest. I'm not sure that skills really covers everything. First of all, they've got to have a body of beliefs, not rigid, but nevertheless sincere and pretty deep-rooted. It can be on the basis of their own intellectual development or their experience, or in the best cases, usually a mixture of both, of people who've looked around themselves. Some from a very young age, others a bit older, but nevertheless, they looked around, they've decided that the world can and should be improved, and they're going to make a commitment to doing it. And then they will, most of the people I'm thinking of, have communication skills. Doesn't mean that they're great platform orators. It does mean that they can be persuasive users of argument, hopefully based on fact, on reality, rather than on illusion, nostalgia, and the other things that get in the way. And the most important thing, I think, is probably they've got to have a sense of purpose, and that central purpose must be to be very broad, to try and make the world a better place. For those people who think of it or have thought of it as a career, quote, quote, well, they tend to be some of the most boring people I've ever met in my life. And whilst one or two of them do make it into, for instance, parliamentary politics or even into government, I've yet to encounter one who's a careerist politician who's been any good at making decisions or showing courage, which is, I think, probably, well, it is. It's a necessary quality. It should come with a package, really, because if you haven't got any guts, you're not going to be much of a representative anyway. You're always going to be either following orders or fashion. And that's not much good when you're trying to represent people, let alone lead people. Yeah, that's pretty much. There's no set formula. Every individual has got qualities. Some people nourish those qualities with learning, practice, effort, hard work, generosity, compassion, those means of useful expression. And I put the emphasis on useful. I think a sense of humor is useful as well. It's not crucial, but if you're serious about representing people and representing ideas, if you haven't got a sense of humor, I think life can be extra hard. Both in terms of communicating ideas, because an effective joke will carry a hell of a lot more than tears. And secondly, simply in being able to live life as a human being. There's a saying in politics, if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined the circus. And that's pretty good advice, actually. Superficial, but quite useful. If what you're thinking of, it just occurs to me, what you're thinking of is the ability to move crowds, to shift the opinions of audiences, to delight them with some argumentative dexterity or humor or empathy. There's a real difficulty now in your young age and my old age, and it is that politicians, so many of them, including very good people, have got fearful of colorful expression. That's partly, I think, from various analyses that I've looked at and heard, because of the way in which I could be represented as the Welsh windbag. And it made certainly one generation of politicians nervous about trying to use expansive language to paint pictures, as I've sometimes put it, in order to stimulate fresh sentiments, fresh enthusiasm, commitment, as well as used in attack as well. And I think that people will recover the willingness to communicate forcefully and effectively. But in addition to attacks on people like myself, which has deterred some engagement in what is written off as emotion and actually is authentic commitment. More important in many ways is that the whole environment of communication has changed, especially with the coming of social media. And it means, therefore, that anyone who raises their voice is dismissed as shouty. I understand that. Some people who raise their voice are shouty, and it's empty vessels making the most noise. But when people are using assertive, incisive language, they are worth listening to very often. Not always, but very often. And people shouldn't be reluctant to express themselves in graphic terms. They don't have to be insulting or crude or bullying. They can simply say it like it is. And if they feel it deeply enough, genuinely feel it deeply enough, then that can come across. So I think that talent is there, or that attribute. I won't even call it a talent. That attribute is there, but there are sometimes difficult circumstances, off-putting circumstances, which makes it difficult to express in the way that was fairly customary a generation or two ago.
Thank you. Yeah, so speaking of the media, in your era, you're hounded by the media. And nowadays, even back then, the media is pretty much only controlled by one man. And how do we ensure that the power to persuade doesn't continue just in the hands of the few?
Well, one thing that Enoch Powell said that I agree with him, it is about the only thing I think, and that is that for a politician to complain about newspaper reporting is like a sailor complaining about the sea. I mean, this is the environment, and it's no good whinging about it, even when they're pretty nasty. We're not going to secure the scale of change in the ownership of Britain's newspapers or the bigotry of the owners, all of whom have got in common, of course, Rothermere and what's the name of the people who own the Telegraph, or the one man, the surviving twin, and the Express, and obviously Murdoch newspapers. They've all got in common the fact that they're tax exiles. And the other thing they've got in common is they try to teach us what patriotism is. I find that quite amusing. But they own newspapers in order to try and influence and control opinion. They don't keep dogs and expect them not to bark. And so that's the environment. We're not going to change that for a long time to come until those people are completely overwhelmed by social media forms of communication. And of course, that can be a very mixed blessing in any case, especially when you've got automated opinion being run out of Moscow or wherever it's run from, that prompts opinions amongst people without a great deal of thought and can become very intrusive and extremely distorting. So if people are on their guard against that, okay, bring it on. But before that happens, we're going to have some decades of prejudiced and prejudicial reporting in our newspapers. And I think the best way for people to safeguard against that is maybe to move to newspapers where there's a more balanced and fair expression of fact and opinion, where there's an effort to distinguish between the reporting of reality, of fact, and the expression of opinion. The only daily newspapers doing that with any serious intent at the moment are, best of all, the Financial Times, the Guardian, and to some extent the Independent. The Times sometimes strives, but doesn't make much of a job of it, really, by comparison with its reputation as the thunderer. The Mirror makes a serious effort. It's alone amongst the tabloids that does that, to try and ensure, first of all, people know where it stands, and secondly, to try and give some prominence to what could be called serious stories amongst the galaxy of chat and gossip and superficial nonsense, which can be entertaining, but isn't much good to the progress of the human race. So that's the sea, to continue the analogy, in which we swim. The important thing, I come back to a point I made earlier, is that people develop their sense of discernment for themselves and keep on trying to add to their comprehension and their insights, not by arduous study, but by simply being alive to what's going on around them in their neighborhood, in their family, in their community, in their country, and of course in the world.
Yeah. I've got a question here on infighting. We talked about it a little bit earlier. The Labour Party is often dealing with, and currently dealing with, internal disputes and splits. How do you think, or do you think it's damned to always do this, or do you think there's a way that we can stop the constant infighting in the Labour Party?
There is, and if you really were an anorak, you could go back to the years between about 1989 and 92, when that was the condition of the Labour Party. But it had required years of organization, attention to detail, micromanagement, really, that I undertook together with one or two colleagues, because the state of the party when I became leader was such that that was required. There were broad brushes that I could use to try and persuade large groups of party members, the Parliamentary Labour Party, the National Executive Committee, people on the Trades Union Congress General Council, and some of them came quite easily because they were already what I call the sensible democratic socialists. Others took more persuading. Some of it was arduous. Some of it was very assertive. I'm choosing my words carefully. None of it was bullying, because I kept on telling people, you volunteered for all this. Nobody made you join. There is no compulsion. There's just common sense. And you must decide whether you want to treat politics as a hobby or as something that's going to affect the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. If you're serious, that's what you do. If you're not serious, please take up stamp collecting or fly fishing. It's much more interesting, and you do less harm. So we got to the stage, by the time we got the major policy documents adopted in 1989, where the French had pretty much fallen over the edge. we had a tiny handful of dedicated, self-indulgent nonconformists who just wanted to carry on in the old ways. But as I say, they literally were, you could count them on one hand. And that continued pretty much after 92, partly because people had developed the habit of self-discipline, even in very mundane activities like debates in their ward branch or their general committee in the constituencies. They didn't pass stupid resolutions that were never going to be endorsed and would never be carried into policy. And having developed that habit, they stopped picking fights with each other. And the ones who did pick fights went off and joined the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds or something, and didn't bother the Labour Party. And then the sheer experience of yet another defeat reinforced this idea of self-discipline and purpose. And then with the advent of Tony Blair, and to a degree, John Smith, it really looked as if we had a winner leading the party, and people focused on trying to maximize that win, which of course provides for the best kind of discipline in any organization, whether it's military or business or politics or anything else, the best kind of family, which is this idea, I don't know if you know the German word Gemütlichkeit, togetherness, this idea which, if it's put into practical effect, is a very powerful force. And that's what it became before 97, lasted for a little bit afterwards. So I guess there was about 10 years in which people put a higher premium on persuading other people rather than having a tussle with their comrades. And that was good. We're getting back there, slowly but surely, partly because of the horrific nature of the government. Secondly, because we've got a steady, no-nonsense, honest, articulate and intelligent man as leader of the party. He's got some people in his front bench who have got those attributes too. Not all of them, but many of them. And that's all very good. So we're getting back there.
Yeah.
I'll make this last point. One of the things to get people in the Labour or indeed any other political party to understand is that if they want to intensify the party's reputation for disorder and, worst of all, preoccupation with its own affairs, which conveys the signal to the general public that they care more about themselves than they care about your well-being, which is pure bloody poison, then if people can understand that, they will change their conduct and improve their relationships and their sense of purpose and perspective. And in democracy, that's the best you can hope for, really, because prayer won't do it, regimentation won't do it, simply giving orders won't do it, using bayonets won't do it. So you're stuck with the strength of the human character. And much of the time, it really works.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you to you for watching this. Like the video and subscribe. Thank you.